What my younger brother did not know was that my boy had been secretly trained in extreme physical survival skills for several years to protect himself from abusers exactly like him. He had absolutely no idea that this quiet child was fully prepared to take down a grown adult in exactly 15 seconds without showing any hesitation. If you have ever had to stand up against your own toxic blood relatives to protect your child from generational trauma, please subscribe to my channel and follow this journey to see exactly how I shattered our cycle of violence forever. 6 o'clock on Thanksgiving evening arrived with the dry sound of silver forks repeatedly hitting porcelain plates inside the dining room belonging to my father, Alvin. The atmosphere surrounding the long table felt incredibly suffocating from the very beginning, because Dad immediately steered the conversation toward his favorite toxic topic. He took a slow sip of his beverage before making deliberate remarks about how children growing up without a strong male pillar always end up becoming complete failures in society. Dad spoke with a tone of absolute certainty that left no room for any differing opinions. Dean did not miss the opportunity to chime in right away to fully support that harmful narrative. He openly criticized my entire approach to single motherhood while sitting back in his wooden chair with a highly arrogant posture. Dean then shifted his aggressive focus directly onto Jasper by adopting an incredibly bossy tone to order the boy to go fetch him another cold beverage from the kitchen refrigerator. He spoke to my teenage son as if Jasper was nothing more than a hired servant meant to cater to his every unpredictable whim. Jasper maintained absolute silence throughout this entire unprovoked humiliation, without showing a single trace of typical teenage intimidation. The boy did not argue or complain about the ridiculous demand being placed upon him during a supposedly peaceful holiday meal. Jasper simply sat there looking across the table at Dean with an incredibly flat gaze that contained absolutely zero fear, but also lacked any obvious signs of outward rebellion. It was the quiet observation of someone who was mentally analyzing a potential threat rather than cowering before the loud aggression. That calm defiance clearly irritated Dean because he fully expected immediate compliance from anyone younger than himself. When Jasper did not immediately stand up from his chair to serve him, Dean shifted his body weight sideways to lightly tap the thick leather belt wrapped securely around his waist. The subtle slapping sound of his palm against the sturdy leather echoed slightly in the quiet dining room to serve as a physical warning. "In my house, disrespectful kids are taught with this," Dean stated coldly while keeping his right hand resting deliberately on the dark leather strap. Dad paused his eating just long enough to nod his head in total agreement with that highly threatening gesture aimed directly at my child. He was publicly validating a deeply entrenched system of domestic terror right in front of us while pretending it was normal family discipline. He wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin before delivering his own supporting statement to reinforce the atmosphere of intimidation dominating the room. "Men must know how to use pain to teach, otherwise he will become useless," Dad added casually before returning his full attention back to his roasted turkey. I gripped the edge of the wooden table so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white under the warm glow of the dining room chandelier. Every protective instinct inside my body screamed at me to grab my son to walk out the front door immediately without looking back. However, I forced myself to remain seated because reacting with visible panic was exactly what those two men desperately wanted to see from me. I glanced over at Jasper to check on his emotional state, but found him still perfectly composed despite the rapidly escalating hostility. The heavy silence that followed their aggressive threats felt like a thick blanket suffocating the remaining oxygen out of the entire house. Dean continued glaring at Jasper while chewing his food with an exaggerated slowness designed to firmly establish his dominance over the dining table. They both honestly believed their coordinated display of toxic masculinity had successfully terrified us into total submission. 20 years ago, right inside this very same living room, that exact leather belt successfully taught me how to remain completely silent. Dad routinely unfastened that thick strap from his waist to deliver severe physical punishments for the most baseless childhood mistakes imaginable. He firmly believed that instilling deep physical fear was the only effective method to maintain absolute control over his dependent family members. The distinct metallic sound of the heavy buckle hitting the floor became a permanent psychological trigger that haunted my thoughts long after the physical bruises faded. Every minor infraction, like spilling a glass of water or speaking slightly too loudly, resulted in a terrifying demonstration of his patriarchal dominance. Dad would shout loudly while towering menacingly over my trembling body. "Do you honestly think you have the right to choose how to live in this house?" During those highly traumatic sessions on the cold hardwood floor, Dean usually stood quietly hiding behind the narrow hallway corner to observe everything. He never displayed any typical signs of childish panic or shed any sympathetic tears while watching his older sister suffer through those deeply painful moments. His youthful eyes carefully studied every single aggressive movement Dad made, with an incredibly disturbing sense of eager curiosity instead of natural horror. "She deserves that because she never knows how to listen," Dean would quietly murmur to himself while soaking in the brutal domestic scene unfolding before him. That specific toxic environment slowly molded Dean into an exact psychological replica of the man who mercilessly ruled our household with a cruel iron fist. He completely absorbed the deeply flawed philosophy that true masculine authority could only be established through consistent threats of physical violence against weaker targets. Growing up alongside him meant constantly watching him apply those exact same controlling behaviors toward his peers at school or anyone who dared to challenge his fragile ego. He genuinely confused raw fear with genuine respect, because our father systematically erased any other healthy definition of love from his developing adolescent mind. Seeing him perfectly mimic those aggressive physical postures confirmed that the ugly cycle of domestic abuse was successfully passing down to the next male generation. Reaching legal adulthood finally provided me with the perfect opportunity to escape that suffocating atmosphere of constant domestic terror forever. I packed my limited belongings into a single small suitcase during the middle of the quiet night to physically remove myself from their deeply poisonous influence. Securing my own independent life far away from that oppressive riverside house became my absolute highest priority during those difficult early years of newfound freedom. Working multiple demanding jobs allowed me to build a secure financial foundation where nobody could ever use money to force my silent compliance again. Building a truly safe environment required completely severing the heavy emotional chains that previously bound me to their deeply warped definition of family loyalty. Looking back at those traumatic childhood memories only strengthened my absolute resolve to protect my own child from experiencing similar psychological horrors. I made a sacred internal commitment that Jasper would never have to endure that sick form of household discipline under any conceivable circumstances. Breaking the painful generational cycle of abuse meant ensuring no aggressive relative would ever raise a hand against my son while I was still drawing breath on this earth. My entire adult existence shifted toward creating a peaceful reality where my growing boy could thrive without constantly anticipating the terrifying sound of a leather belt. He truly deserved to live freely without carrying the heavy burden of generational trauma that had completely destroyed my own early developmental years. 8 years ago, I held Jasper by his small hand while walking through the heavy glass doors of a martial arts studio, smelling strongly of fresh rubber mats in the busy commercial district. Securing a reliable method of physical self-defense for my young son led me directly to a highly experienced martial arts instructor named Nelson. My personal motivation for seeking out professional combat training remained incredibly clear from the very first moment we sat down together inside his small, quiet office. I did not bring him here to fight anyone or start pointless trouble with other kids. I explained to Nelson with absolute conviction in my voice. I brought him here so that someday he will never have to take a severe beating like I did growing up." Nelson completely understood the heavy generational trauma driving my urgent decision without requiring any further uncomfortable explanations about my abusive family history. The rigorous physical journey into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu officially began that same afternoon, with Jasper stepping cautiously onto the padded floor, wearing a slightly oversized white training uniform. Nelson specifically focused his initial lessons on teaching the young boy how to maintain total internal calmness whenever placed under extreme physical pressure by a heavier opponent. Reacting with blind anger or sudden panic usually leads to highly costly mistakes during a dangerous physical confrontation against a much larger, aggressive person. The greatest weakness of any bully is always his own blinding arrogance. Nelson often reminded his young students while demonstrating various defensive techniques on the practice mat. He carefully instructed Jasper to completely avoid matching raw muscle against muscle because a smaller person will inevitably lose that specific type of direct physical battle. The core principle of their daily training revolved around using the aggressive forward momentum and heavy body weight of a hostile attacker as the primary leverage needed to effectively neutralize them. Every single grappling session taught my developing son how to smoothly redirect hostile energy instead of hopelessly trying to absorb the damaging impact of a violent strike. Learning how to properly breathe while being firmly pinned to the ground gave him the crucial mental clarity required to survive scenarios designed to induce pure, uncontrollable panic. Jasper absorbed these vital survival lessons perfectly over the passing years, while developing a highly disciplined mindset alongside his rapidly growing physical capabilities. He eventually formed a completely impenetrable emotional shell that successfully masked his deeply ingrained combat reflexes from everyone living outside of our immediate household. This quiet demeanor caused Dad and Dean to foolishly view him as a pathetic, vulnerable target simply because he rarely spoke back or displayed any aggressive masculine posturing. They constantly mistook his practiced stillness for natural cowardice because their highly toxic worldview could not comprehend true strength existing without loud verbal threats or overt physical intimidation. I purposely kept his extensive martial arts background a closely guarded secret during every single holiday gathering or mandatory family visitation over the last 8 consecutive years. Revealing his advanced grappling skills would only invite unnecessary physical challenges from Dean or spark furious ongoing arguments with Dad regarding the proper way to raise a fatherless boy. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu effectively became an invisible protective shield, wrapping securely around my child whenever we were tragically forced to occupy the exact same room as my toxic relatives. Knowing he finally possessed the exact physical tools necessary to successfully defend his own body brought me a profound sense of psychological peace that I never once experienced during my own deeply abusive childhood. 8:15 in the evening arrived with the loud scraping sound of heavy wooden chairs being pushed violently across the dining room floor to signal the definitive end of our meal. That harsh noise simultaneously marked the complete erasure of any remaining boundaries separating normal family dysfunction from actual physical danger. Dean immediately used my son's perceived disrespectful attitude during dinner as a convenient excuse to aggressively back Jasper into the narrow corner located right outside the cramped laundry room. The much larger man intentionally used his significant physical size to block the only available exit path leading back toward the safety of the front door. He leaned his upper body forward to trap the boy against the painted drywall, while intentionally breathing heavily to project maximum intimidation toward his younger target. Despite being cornered in that highly restricted space with an angry adult towering directly over him, Jasper maintained his absolute silence without taking a single step backward away from the immediate threat. The teenage boy kept both of his arms hanging completely relaxed beside his hips, instead of raising his hands defensively to protect his face from a potential strike. His intensely focused eyes remained steadily locked onto the center of his uncle's right shoulder to carefully track any sudden aggressive movements without showing an ounce of typical fear. Recognizing the rapidly escalating danger unfolding in the hallway prompted me to quietly press the video record button on my smartphone before hiding the device securely behind my back. Capturing undeniable digital evidence of this hostile confrontation felt absolutely necessary because the authorities would definitely need objective proof regarding the terrifying reality of what usually happened inside this house. The blinking red light on my screen confirmed that every single second of their threatening behavior was being permanently documented for future legal purposes. My immediate maternal instinct pushed my entire body forward with the clear intention of physically positioning myself directly between the aggressive grown man and my teenage child. Before my feet could carry me across the short distance separating us in the hallway, Dad violently grabbed my left shoulder with an incredibly forceful grip that instantly bruised my skin. His thick fingers dug painfully into my flesh as he forcefully yanked my body backward against the wall to prevent any further parental interference on my part. He firmly planted his own heavy frame in front of me to ensure Dean had uninterrupted access to carry out his twisted version of household discipline. "Stay completely out of it because this is exactly how he finally learns to be a real man," Dad whispered harshly into my ear while maintaining his crushing physical hold on my collarbone. Standing only a few inches away from his trapped target, Dean began deliberately unfastening the heavy metal buckle resting securely against his waist, with a sickeningly calm demeanor. He pulled the thick, dark leather strap out through his denim belt loops with an agonizingly slow and highly practiced motion designed to maximize psychological torture before the actual physical pain began. The casual nature of his deliberate movement strongly suggested he had successfully performed this exact terrifying routine hundreds of times before behind closed doors to assert his absolute dominance over weaker victims. The distinct metallic clicking sound echoed loudly against the confined walls of the laundry area to push the suffocating tension toward its absolute breaking point. He folded the thick leather strap entirely in half while gripping the looped end tightly within his dominant right fist to maximize the impending physical impact against his intended victim. He deliberately slapped the folded leather against his own thigh once to test the weight of the strap before raising his arm higher into the air. "Do you honestly think staying completely silent makes you look smart right now?" Dean demanded with a twisted sneer spreading across his face as he prepared to swing his chosen weapon directly at my son. "Let me personally teach you what happens in the real world when an adult tells you to listen without questioning authority." The exact moment Dean swung his right arm high into the air to bring the folded leather belt slicing downward through the room, every single background noise seemed to completely shut off. He unleashed the heavy strap with the full terrifying force of his accumulated anger, while remaining absolutely certain his younger nephew would immediately cower against the drywall in total submission. The aggressive older man fully expected to hear the familiar sounds of painful whimpering that usually accompanied his brutal brand of household punishment. What happened next completely shattered his pathetic illusion of masculine superiority because Jasper did not flinch or retreat away from the incoming physical violence. Instead of curling into a defensive ball to absorb the painful impact, my son smoothly stepped forward inside the striking arc by shifting his body weight slightly to the left side. He extended both of his hands upward with incredible precision to firmly catch the descending wrist of his stunned attacker before the leather weapon could ever make contact with his face or shoulders. Using the intense forward momentum generated by that reckless and hateful swing, Jasper executed a flawless hip rotation to utilize his opponent's heavier body weight entirely against him. The focused teenager essentially transformed the aggressive downward force into a powerful mechanical lever without relying on any raw muscle strength to overpower the dangerous adult man. He pulled the trapped wrist aggressively forward while blocking the lower body to instantly sweep the much larger man completely off his established footing in a blindingly fast motion. Dean flew awkwardly through the confined hallway space before crashing violently onto his back across the hard ceramic tile floor near the washing machine. The incredibly loud thud of his spine impacting the unyielding ground echoed through the narrow laundry area like a definitive judicial sentence, finally ending a decades-long reign of domestic terror. All the breath escaped his lungs in a sharp, pathetic gasp, while the leather belt slipped completely out of his useless fingers to slide harmlessly across the smooth tiles toward the opposite wall. Before the fallen man could even attempt to process the shocking reality of his sudden and humiliating physical defeat, Jasper seamlessly transitioned his own body position to maintain absolute control over the dynamic situation. He swiftly twisted the captured right arm sharply behind his uncle's back, while applying downward pressure to establish a perfectly executed joint lock, directly isolating the vulnerable shoulder capsule. The entire breathtaking sequence of defensive combat from the initial belt swing to the final inescapable submission hold took exactly 15 seconds to unfold right before my amazed eyes. "Do not move a single muscle or I will immediately dislocate your shoulder joint," Jasper stated with a completely cold tone, lacking any typical adrenaline-fueled excitement usually found in a street fight. Dad released his tight physical grip on my collarbone in absolute stunned disbelief while staring downward at his supposedly invincible son, lying utterly helpless beneath a quiet teenager. The older man visibly lost all the color in his wrinkled face while struggling to mentally comprehend the sudden violent destruction of his deeply cherished patriarchal hierarchy. "What the hell are you doing down there? Let him go right now!" Dad screamed in a completely panicked voice while frantically stepping backward away from the terrifying scene. I immediately raised my smartphone upward from behind my back to officially stop the ongoing video recording after successfully capturing undeniable digital evidence of their initial unprovoked assault. Without hesitating for even a fraction of a second to debate family loyalty, I tapped the emergency dial button to officially connect my cell phone directly to the 911 police dispatcher to report an active domestic assault. Tuesday morning of the following week began with the sudden sound of heavy fists repeatedly pounding against the wooden surface of my apartment front door. Looking through the small security peephole confirmed my immediate suspicion regarding the unwelcome identities of the aggressive visitors demanding entry into my completely peaceful home. Opening the door revealed Dean standing awkwardly on the concrete threshold while wearing a bulky medical sling to firmly secure his severely injured right shoulder. Dad stood aggressively right beside him, with a deeply furious expression masking his obvious anxiety over the pending criminal assault charges, waiting at the local police station. They traveled all the way across town specifically to forcefully demand my immediate withdrawal of the official police report documenting their violent Thanksgiving actions. Instead of displaying any typical signs of daughterly submission, I firmly planted my feet directly within the doorway to completely block their physical entry into my personal sanctuary. I maintained absolute eye contact with both men while completely ignoring their loud, pathetic excuses regarding the sacred importance of maintaining traditional family loyalty during difficult times. Dad attempted to significantly raise his commanding voice, to forcefully assert his customary patriarchal authority over my completely unwavering maternal decision to protect my teenage son. "Are you seriously going to make a massive legal issue out of a tiny misunderstanding within our own family?" Dad demanded with a dangerously low tone, typically reserved for terrifying, disobedient children. Instead of engaging in another completely pointless screaming match with individuals incapable of understanding healthy boundaries, I calmly retrieved my smartphone from my jacket pocket. I tapped the glowing screen exactly once to press play on the highly incriminating video file, capturing Dean deliberately unfastening his leather belt to threaten Jasper inside the narrow laundry room. The undeniable visual evidence of his terrifyingly casual approach toward domestic violence played clearly on the small screen to instantly silence their ridiculous verbal arguments about simple family misunderstandings. Dad, visibly deflated while watching the undeniable digital proof of their abusive behavior, knowing no competent judge would ever view that violent footage as appropriate household discipline. Without speaking a single word of further explanation, I reached deeper into my dark winter coat pocket to extract a formally folded legal document stamped by the county courthouse. I forcefully shoved the official temporary restraining order directly against Dean's uninjured chest to legally ensure he completely understood the permanent consequences of his violent arrogance. The typed legal paperwork strictly mandated that he maintain a minimum physical distance of 500 feet away from myself and my teenage son at all times. This is not a family anymore, so take this restraining order and never show your face in front of my child again, I stated with absolute chilling finality. I smoothly reached down toward the small decorative table sitting quietly in my entryway to retrieve the exact same dark leather belt he foolishly dropped during his humiliating physical defeat. I tossed the heavy leather strap casually onto the concrete porch landing right next to his expensive shoes like a completely worthless piece of discarded household garbage. The satisfying metallic clatter of the buckle hitting the hard ground served as the final punctuation mark ending our deeply toxic biological relationship forever. I firmly pulled the heavy front door backward until the deadbolt clicked loudly into place to officially lock out that particular generational curse from returning to infect our peaceful lives. 6 months have officially passed since that disastrous Thanksgiving night, turning our daily lives onto a completely new, peaceful page. The severe real-world consequences for their deeply toxic behavior materialized incredibly quickly once the official police records inevitably leaked into the local community. Dean abruptly lost his prestigious financial management position at the corporate firm before he could even attempt to offer his superiors any fabricated explanations regarding his pending criminal assault charge. That highly embarrassing professional termination finally forced those arrogant patriarchal men to take a permanent step backward because modern society absolutely refused to tolerate their outdated concept of domestic violence. Dad and Dean were permanently left isolated inside that gloomy riverside house to stew in their own miserable bitterness without any helpless victims left to physically control or intimidate. Every single neighbor eventually learned about the legal restraining order, stripping away the fake, respectable image they had carefully built over several decades. Meanwhile, my everyday existence alongside Jasper transformed into a completely liberated experience, utterly free from the constant suffocating anxiety of trying to please those abusive relatives. My teenage son proudly began participating in various local Brazilian jiu-jitsu tournaments without needing to hide his impressive physical capabilities from judgmental family members ever again. Watching him confidently step onto the competition mats, wearing his martial arts uniform filled my heart with absolute parental pride because he finally embraced his true strength. He no longer walked with his shoulders slightly hunched to avoid drawing unwanted attention from older men, looking for an easy target to belittle. His instructors frequently praised his remarkable emotional discipline during highly stressful grappling matches against much older tournament competitors. The heavy psychological burden of generational trauma had been completely lifted off his young shoulders thanks to those decisive 15 seconds of flawless physical self-defense. Our small, peaceful household now functions strictly on mutual respect, instead of relying on raw physical fear to establish daily boundaries. Before concluding today's story, our channel officially declares this narrative serves a strictly educational purpose regarding personal boundaries. We aim to highlight the absolute necessity of handling severe domestic crises through appropriate legal channels rather than accepting violence as normal discipline. Evaluating this situation objectively reveals exactly how Sylvia decisively protected herself by permanently severing ties with her toxic abusers. The antagonistic family members ultimately suffered the inevitable destructive consequences resulting directly from their own twisted decisions to enforce patriarchal dominance. Choosing to break away entirely from that oppressive household remained her only viable path toward establishing a genuinely safe environment. Please consider the following profound lessons we can all extract from this incredibly intense family confrontation. Domestic violence will never successfully pass down to the next generation if just one courageous person actively decides to sever that toxic connection forever. Tolerating physical threats from your biological relatives does not protect the family unit, because it merely creates a completely safe environment for future abusers to thrive. Equipping vulnerable children with legitimate physical self-defense skills empowers them with the fundamental human right to maintain absolute control over their own bodies. A healthy personal boundary remains a sacred dividing line that nobody is ever allowed to cross regardless of their shared biological bloodline.